John F. Kennedy Airport bustled with the steady rhythm of early morning travelers, their movements creating a low hum against the soft light filtering through expansive glass walls. There was a feeling of both purpose and hesitation, as if each person carried not only their luggage but also the invisible weight of something deeper, an anticipation, a personal worry, a quiet hope. Moving calmly among them was Samuel Cooper, a tall, composed man in his mid-40s. His dark skin and quiet, steady gaze gave him a presence that, though understated, was rarely overlooked. Samuel's navy blue polo shirt and light linen pants suited his frame well. They were practical clothes, chosen with the ease of someone accustomed to travel. He walked with purpose, yet his steps were measured. The steps of a man who knew the rhythm of airports, who understood both the excitement of coming and going and the gentle ache of leaving. Today's journey, however, held a touch of lightness for Samuel. He was heading home. New York had been a success. Samuel had come for critical meetings concerning a billion-dollar contract between his company, a leader in technology, and one of the nation's largest airlines. As the vice president of global operations, he had reached his position through years of focus, dedication, and a quiet but fierce determination to rise beyond the assumptions others might make about him. And these assumptions had been many, often subtle, always present. They had shown themselves in the raised eyebrows, in the careful, measured words, in glances exchanged just a moment too long. This, Samuel had learned to navigate with a practiced grace, a quiet endurance passed down through generations. Today, as he walked toward his gate, Samuel allowed his thoughts to wander to his family. Claire, his wife of 20 years, would be waiting for him in Atlanta. She was the steady compass of his life, the one who had been with him since college, sharing in both the bright days and the late nights of work and worry. He thought of his children, Malik and Amara, and a faint smile crossed his face. He looked forward to telling them about his trip, about how the contract would not only strengthen his company's standing but also ensure stability for thousands of employees. It was not just a professional achievement, it was a reminder of the impact he could make. As he approached the boarding gate, Samuel handed his ticket to the flight attendant on duty, a young woman named Lisa Harrison. Lisa, with her carefully tied blonde hair and clear blue eyes, was known among her peers for her efficiency. Yet her approach to her work was marked by a rigid attention to protocol, often leaving little room for the warmth or openness passengers might expect. As Samuel handed her his ticket, she scanned it and then paused, an expression of hesitation flickering across her face. Her eyes lingered on him, taking in his appearance, a simple polo, linen pants. It was a first-class ticket, and it was valid, but still, something about Samuel seemed to shift her composure. If only for a moment. Sir, please wait a moment, she said, her voice neutral, but her tone edged with a subtle coldness. Samuel glanced at her, a little surprised. There was nothing unusual about his ticket, but he nodded politely, watching as she walked over to speak with the supervisor, an older man with graying hair who seemed somewhat weary of her concern. Samuel couldn't hear their conversation, but he noticed the brief glance the supervisor gave him before he shook his head, clearly dismissing whatever concern Lisa had raised. All right, sir, Lisa said upon her return, handing back his ticket with a tight expression. You may proceed. Her tone held no warmth, no hint of the typical friendliness offered to other passengers. Samuel noticed this but remained quiet, deciding to let it go. After all, it was a long flight home, and he didn't want to carry any tension with him. Instead, he nodded, a reserved acknowledgement of her words, and moved toward the plane. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, Samuel felt a calm settle over him. The spacious seats, the faint lavender scent in the air, it was all familiar and comforting. He placed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, took his seat, and allowed himself a moment to relax. Closing his eyes and leaning back, he let his thoughts drift to Claire, to the calmness of home, to the laughter of his children. But just as he began to feel a sense of ease, he sensed someone standing beside him. Opening his eyes, he found Lisa again, her expression now more serious, her tone even more direct. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me, she said, There was no explanation, no reassurance, just a direct instruction. Samuel looked at her, his mind briefly puzzled. He could feel the attention of other passengers, eyes turning toward him, curious glances gathering. He knew these moments. The quiet scrutiny, the tension that thickened the air in ways others might not notice. Did something happen? He asked calmly, keeping his voice steady, respectful. There was no outward expression of frustration, though inside, he felt a familiar discomfort rising, an unease that he had hoped to leave behind. There appears to be an error with your ticket, sir. This seat belongs to someone else. Her words were clear, her tone resolute, yet Samuel knew there was no mistake. He had purchased this ticket, as he always did, and it was in his name. Still, he didn't resist. There were situations where resistance could lead to misunderstandings. Or worse. So, without a word, he stood, retrieving his bag, and followed Lisa through the aisle. As they passed through the cabin, whispers filled the air, faces turned, some sympathetic, some simply curious. Samuel walked with a quiet dignity, choosing not to respond to the murmurs or the watchful glances. Instead, he simply followed, taking each step as it came, until they reached an economy seat in the middle of the plane. Here, Lisa stopped. Please sit here, I'll check what happened and return to talk with you, she said, still in that cold, unwavering tone. Samuel settled into the seat, feeling the unfamiliar closeness of other passengers, the lack of space pressing around him. He took a slow breath, his thoughts turning inward as he sat there, surrounded by a subtle buzz of people and movement. He could feel the quiet frustration rising, but with it came a sense of clarity. He understood, in that moment, that there would be something to say after this flight, something that needed to be addressed. The hum of conversation filled the plane as passengers continued boarding, oblivious to the quiet tension that Samuel felt sitting in his cramped seat in economy class. He shifted slightly, feeling the unfamiliar pressure of confined space. He was used to a certain ease when he traveled, an ease he had earned through years of steady work and countless hours spent in meetings, negotiations, and quiet perseverance. Yet here he was, surrounded by strangers, some casting sympathetic glances in his direction, others absorbed in their own worlds. The steady hum around him seemed to contrast sharply with the weight of the situation. Samuel's gaze settled on the small window to his side, where the airport ground crew moved about, preparing the plane for departure. Outside, everything looked routine, calm, mechanical, a world governed by procedure. But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more profound had just occurred. A subtle but cutting reminder of the distance between appearances and reality, of assumptions and the quiet biases that so often went unspoken. He took a steady breath, reminding himself of what he had learned early on. In moments like these, patience and restraint were often his best allies. He recalled his father's words from long ago, spoken with the careful wisdom of a man who had faced prejudice all his life. Sometimes, the world will see you for what it assumes you are, not for who you actually are. And in those times, the strength to remain dignified is all your own. Samuel's father had been a man of simple pride, a mechanic who had worked long hours with his hands, fixing engines, making things run smoothly for others. He had taught Samuel that excellence was its own form of quiet resistance, a way to navigate a world that often saw only the surface. As a boy, Samuel had watched his father work tirelessly, knowing that each day was a silent assertion of his dignity. And it was this lesson that Samuel had carried with him through his own life. Through each promotion, each contract, each quiet act of resilience. He let these thoughts anchor him as he waited, glancing occasionally at the front of the plane, half expecting Lisa to reappear. The feeling of being watched lingered, a mix of curiosity and pity from those nearby who perhaps sensed his discomfort but did not understand its depth. Still, he sat, composed, silently observing the scene around him. After some time, the familiar click of heels on the aisle floor alerted him, and he looked up to see Lisa returning. Her face unreadable, her gaze fixed on him with the same sternness as before. "Mr. Cooper," she said in a voice that carried both authority and finality. "We've checked your ticket, and there is indeed an error. Unfortunately, the flight is fully booked." so we cannot accommodate you in first class at this time. We apologize for the inconvenience. And we will ensure you are compensated adequately." Her words were clinical, detached, devoid of empathy. Samuel listened, his expression calm but unwavering. The same way he had learned to navigate countless business negotiations. He knew that what was being offered wasn't an apology, it was a dismissal. An attempt to smooth over something that ran deeper than a seating arrangement. But he kept his silence, meeting her gaze without flinching. "All right," he replied, his voice measured, as if acknowledging a minor inconvenience rather than a slight against his dignity. "I would appreciate it if this could be formally documented, along with a written explanation from the airline." Lisa blinked, caught off guard for a moment by his composed response, then quickly regained her composure. "Of course, sir," she replied, her tone shifting slightly, betraying a hint of relief that he wasn't pressing further. "We'll have everything in writing for you upon arrival." With that, she walked away, and Samuel remained in his seat, his mind settling back into a quiet, thoughtful place. There was no triumph in his restraint, no satisfaction in the interaction. It was simply another moment in a lifetime of managing the often invisible complexities of what it meant to exist in a world that sometimes refused to see him fully. As the plane began to taxi, Samuel leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He tried to focus on his family, on the warmth of home, on Claire's smile and the laughter of his children. Yet, beneath these comforting thoughts lay a current of something unresolved, a determination. A reminder that this moment, however small in the grander scheme of his life, deserved more than silent acceptance. It was not anger that he felt, but a steady, unshakable conviction that he had the power to transform this incident into something meaningful. The flight continued, with the usual sounds of passengers settling in, the gentle hum of the engines, the occasional murmur of conversations fading into silence as people drifted into sleep or absorbed themselves in their own thoughts. For Samuel, the journey stretched longer than usual, not in distance, but in the awareness that something had shifted in him. He sensed a quiet resolve building, one that would extend beyond this single flight and carry into the days ahead. As he glanced around the cabin, he could see that life continued as it always did, small, ordinary moments unfolding without interruption. Yet for him, this was more than a simple inconvenience, it was a quiet reminder that dignity, once compromised, must be reclaimed, not just for himself, but for everyone who still faced such silent battles. When he landed in Atlanta, the wheels touching down with a soft thud, he was ready to meet the world with renewed clarity. And as he disembarked, his steps were steady, filled with the quiet resolve of a man who knew that, while this incident was merely a small moment in his life, it would mark a turning point, not only for him but, perhaps, for those who would hear his story. The bustling terminal in Atlanta was a world unto itself, filled with travelers coming and going, each with their own stories, their own burdens to carry. Samuel moved through the crowd, his steps measured and unhurried, as if absorbing the subtle quiet of his own thoughts amidst the surrounding noise. He had been in countless airports, seen thousands of strangers, yet today, the experience felt different, a layer of gravity overlaying the usual routines of travel. There was an air of finality, a sense of purpose brewing quietly within him. As he walked toward the baggage claim, his mind replayed the morning's events in fragments, the dispassionate look in Lisa's eyes, her rigid adherence to protocol, the tension of moving through the aisles under the eyes of strangers. For most, this might have been a minor inconvenience, an annoyance at worst, but for Samuel, it was a reminder of the quiet, pervasive presence of bias that shadowed so many everyday moments, a reminder that even his position and success could not always shield him from prejudice. He collected his bag, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and walked toward the exit where he knew he'd find Lisa waiting with a voucher. Her formality doubling as an apology that fell just short of meaning anything real. True to expectation, she was there, standing by the exit, her gaze downcast, her shoulders carrying a stiffness that hinted at discomfort. As he approached, she glanced up and handed him an envelope without meeting his eyes. "Mr. Cooper," she began, her voice carefully composed, Here is the compensation voucher for the inconvenience. Once again, we apologize for the disruption. Samuel took the envelope without looking at its contents. This was never about the compensation. For him, the entire incident was about something larger. A quiet but pressing need to address the treatment he had received. He could feel the weight of years of patience within him, of moments let pass. Small indignities shouldered in silence. But this time, something in him knew he couldn't simply let it go. Lisa, may I ask you a question? He began. His voice calm, his tone steady but intent. She looked at him, taken aback by the directness of his question. A moment of hesitation in her eyes. Of course, sir, she replied, though there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. Samuel held her gaze, his expression thoughtful but unwavering. What exactly made you think I shouldn't be sitting in first class? He asked. His tone even and unaccusatory, as if he were simply asking for clarity. But he knew that this question carried weight, that it was more than a casual inquiry. It was an opportunity for her to look beyond the surface, to reflect on her actions without the safety of dismissive excuses. For a moment, Lisa was silent, her mind clearly racing, words caught in her throat. She struggled to find a response. Something that could excuse her behavior without revealing the prejudice that had shaped it. She shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking, her voice hesitant. I was just following procedures. Sir, sometimes there are errors with tickets. And we need to make sure everything is in order. Samuel nodded slowly, allowing her words to settle in the air between them. I understand that mistakes happen, he said, his voice still calm. But it felt to me like there was more to this situation than a simple mistake. It felt like you judged me before you even knew who I was. Lisa's gaze dropped, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. It was clear that his words had struck a chord, something she couldn't easily dismiss or rationalize. She took a breath, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. I didn't mean to offend you, Mr. Cooper. He acknowledged her words with a slight nod, his gaze kind but steady. I believe that, he replied, but this isn't just about me. There are so many others who experience this every day. People who don't have the power to question it, to make it known. I'm speaking up because it needs to change, not just for me, but for everyone who deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what they wear. He paused, letting the silence sit between them, allowing her to truly absorb what he was saying. He could see the conflict on her face, a mixture of regret and an uncomfortable self-awareness taking shape. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a reflection. A moment for her to see herself as he had seen her. To recognize the small but profound impact of her actions. Samuel continued, his voice gentle but firm. I'm not here to harm you, Lisa, but I can't just let this pass either. My name is Samuel Cooper, and I'm the Vice President of Global Operations at a company that has a significant contract with the airline you work for. I was on my way back from a meeting to renew that contract. He watched as her face grew pale, the realization settling into her expression. For her, this was no longer an encounter with a passenger. This was a moment that could affect her own future, her own sense of security. Lisa's face softened, her eyes brimming with the weight of what he was telling her. She looked away, visibly humbled, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper. I truly didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't realize. Samuel nodded, sensing her genuine remorse. I believe in second chances, Lisa, he said quietly, his tone forgiving. But take this as an opportunity to reflect on what happened today. To consider how you treat people. All people, regardless of who you think they might be. Sometimes, even the smallest of gestures can leave a lasting impact. With those final words, he turned to leave, the envelope still clutched loosely in his hand, and walked away without looking back. It wasn't triumph he felt, nor anger, only a calm sense of purpose. A quiet conviction that he had done his part to address an injustice in the way he knew best. The conversation was now a memory, a moment left behind, yet one that he knew would ripple far beyond this airport, perhaps even beyond Lisa's own journey. As he walked out into the open air, he felt a lightness, a feeling of resolve. There was a satisfaction not in the outcome itself, but in the knowledge that he had honored his dignity, that he had spoken up not only for himself but for others who might never have the chance to do so. Samuel's drive home from the airport was a familiar one. The cityscape of Atlanta slowly gave way to the quiet neighborhoods he had come to cherish, where he and his family had built a life rooted in shared moments and quiet resilience. The early afternoon sun cast a warm light on the houses lining the streets, giving the entire neighborhood a sense of calm. Yet beneath this calm, Samuel's mind circled back to the morning's events, replaying each detail in muted clarity, each moment carrying its own quiet weight. As he pulled into his driveway, he felt an immediate sense of relief. The house was there, just as he'd left it, a solid, welcoming structure that, to him, symbolized stability and belonging. Before he even had time to step out of the car, his children, Malik and Amara, burst through the front door, their laughter filling the air. They ran to him with the enthusiasm only children could muster, their arms outstretched, their faces bright with joy. He knelt down to hug them, letting their warmth fill the spaces that the day's events had left heavy. His wife, Claire, appeared in the doorway, her smile soft and understanding. She met his eyes as he rose, sensing in a single look that there was more behind his calm expression than he was ready to share. Samuel knew she would wait, allowing him to speak when he was ready. But her presence alone was a comfort, a reminder that he didn't have to bear this silently. They settled into the rhythm of family life. The conversation at the dinner table light and easy, filled with stories from Malik and Amara about their latest school projects and small triumphs. Samuel laughed with them, enjoying the reprieve, choosing not to dwell on the morning. But later, as the house grew quiet, with Claire and the children asleep, Samuel found himself standing by the window, looking out into the night. It was a still night, with only the soft sounds of crickets and the occasional breeze rustling through the trees. Yet in the silence, the events of the day felt closer, pressing gently against his thoughts. It wasn't anger he felt, not even frustration, but something quieter. An understanding of how deeply ingrained prejudice could be. So silent, so unseen, yet present in everyday interactions. He thought back to the look on Lisa's face, the way her expression had shifted from control to confusion, and finally to remorse. It was clear that she hadn't thought twice before acting, that her judgment of him had been almost automatic, as if she hadn't even realized the implications of her actions until he questioned her. In her reaction, Samuel saw a reflection of the larger struggle, a quiet but ongoing tension that affected not just him but countless others. Each in their own silent, unspoken ways. In that stillness, he realized that there was something he could do. He knew that, in his position, he had the opportunity to initiate a conversation that went beyond his own experience. Samuel had always believed in using his influence responsibly, and now he saw that this was an opportunity to push for something lasting, a chance to speak not only for himself but for all those who had been judged unfairly, who had felt unseen, even in plain sight. The next morning, as the sunlight filled the room, Samuel was already at his desk, preparing for his upcoming meetings. Among them was the meeting with the airline executives, where he would discuss the new contract, a deal that would benefit both parties. One he had worked hard to secure. But this time, he decided, the conversation would not only be about numbers and logistics. Today, he would bring something different to the table. When he arrived at the office later that day, he felt a sense of calm purpose. His colleagues greeted him with the usual respect and camaraderie, unaware of the shift in his thoughts, of the quiet determination that underscored his demeanor. As he prepared for the meeting, he made a few notes, his pen moving with steady precision across the page, crafting his thoughts into words that he hoped would resonate. At the meeting, he spoke with his usual calm authority, discussing the details of the contract with professionalism and clarity. But as they neared the end, he paused, letting a thoughtful silence fill the room before he spoke again. "There's one more matter I'd like to address," he began, his tone measured yet firm. The room grew still, his colleagues looking at him with attentive interest. "It concerns the experience I had during my flight yesterday," he continued, careful to keep his words steady. "An experience that reminded me of the subtle but profound impact that unconscious bias can have on the way we interact with each other." He could see the surprise in their faces. A mixture of curiosity and respect. He shared the story simply, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. He described the assumption, the judgment, the quiet dismissal he had felt, a dismissal that, while subtle, had left its mark. As a company, he concluded, we have the opportunity to do more than secure contracts. We have the power to influence change, to set an example that can ripple outward. I would strongly encourage the airline to consider more comprehensive training on bias and empathy, something that would remind employees of the impact their actions can have, no matter how small they may seem. The room was silent, his words hanging in the air. Samuel felt the weight of their attention, sensing that he had planted a seed, something that could grow into meaningful change. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless, a way to take a single experience and use it to foster something larger than himself. Something that might reach others long after this contract was signed. As he left the meeting, he felt a quiet satisfaction. There was no sense of finality, no clear resolution, just the awareness that he had done his part. That he had spoken up not only for himself but for others. The quiet power of his resolve stayed with him. A reminder that change often began with a single voice. A single story, told simply but with purpose. And as he returned to his office, ready to continue his day, he knew that while the path toward change was long and often slow, it was a path worth taking, one step at a time. The days after her encounter with Samuel were quiet but uneasy for Lisa. In her small apartment, the usual comforts, her tidy living room, the books she kept neatly stacked on the coffee table, the warmth of morning light filtering through her curtains, now seemed dimmed. Like they had lost some intangible quality she couldn't name. She couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had shifted inside her. A feeling she couldn't ignore. Lisa's thoughts returned, time and again, to Samuel's words, the quiet dignity with which he had addressed her, the calm but pointed question he had posed at the baggage claim. Lingered in her mind. He hadn't accused her, hadn't raised his voice or demanded any sort of retribution. Instead, he had simply asked her to look at herself, to question what had prompted her assumptions, her actions, and it was this restraint, this quiet conviction, that now weighed on her more heavily than any confrontation might have. She remembered the way he had looked at her, steadily, calmly, as if he were giving her a chance to see herself clearly. And now, in the quiet spaces of her own apartment, Lisa found herself reflecting, unwillingly but inevitably, on the subtle but pervasive patterns of bias that had shaped her actions. She had always considered herself a fair, professional person, one who followed procedure and worked diligently. But now she wondered if perhaps she had followed those rules too closely, allowing them to become a shield, a way to avoid seeing others as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles. Lisa's work at the airline had always been about efficiency, about moving quickly and checking each box with precision. She prided herself on her dedication, on her ability to keep things running smoothly, often under immense pressure. But she hadn't realized until now how much of that efficiency had come at the expense of empathy. How many assumptions she had made without a second thought. Sitting alone in her living room one evening, Lisa reached for her laptop and searched for articles on bias, on the subtle ways in which people could be influenced by assumptions they were hardly aware of. She read about unconscious bias, about how deeply ingrained it could be, shaping perceptions and judgments without the person even realizing it. Each article felt like a small revelation, a mirror held up to her own actions, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable possibility that she had been complicit in a system of prejudice she had once thought herself separate from. One line in particular struck her. True self-reflection requires courage. A willingness to question not only what we do, but why we do it. She read the sentence over and over, feeling its weight. It was a call to confront the quiet but powerful forces that influenced her thoughts and actions. Forces that she had allowed to go unexamined for too long. In the days that followed, Lisa began to look at her work differently. She found herself pausing during routine tasks, questioning her responses to passengers, noticing the small, almost automatic judgments that sprang to mind. She realized, with a mix of surprise and shame, How often she had let these judgments shape her interactions. It was a subtle thing, an assumption about a passenger's background, their intentions, their worthiness to sit in a certain seat or receive a certain level of service. She had always thought of herself as a professional, fair-minded person, but now she saw that fairness required more than simply following the rules. In her quiet way, Lisa started seeking out resources, looking for ways to better understand the biases she had never truly confronted. She reached out to a colleague she respected, a senior flight attendant named Maria who had been with the airline for decades. Maria had always treated every passenger with a warmth that seemed to come naturally. A calm empathy that Lisa admired but had never fully understood. When Lisa asked to speak with her after their shift, Maria listened without judgment, her face open and patient. "Maria, how do you stay so present with people?" Lisa asked, struggling to find the right words. "I mean, how do you treat everyone with the same kindness, no matter who they are?" Maria smiled gently, her eyes kind. "It's not about kindness, really. It's about curiosity, about allowing yourself to see people as they are, without letting your own assumptions cloud things." She paused, considering her words. It's easy to judge when we're rushed or stressed. But if you take a moment to just see the person in front of you, you find there's always more to them than you think. Lisa nodded, feeling the truth in Maria's words. She had spent years on autopilot, letting her assumptions take the place of genuine curiosity, of real engagement. And now, for the first time, she felt a desire to change that, to approach her work with a newfound awareness, an openness that she hadn't realized was lacking. Over the next few weeks, Lisa began to notice small changes in herself. She took a moment to make eye contact with each passenger, to see them as individuals, not simply as ticket holders or names on a manifest. She noticed how this small act of acknowledgement softened her own approach. How it reminded her that each person carried their own burdens, their own quiet histories. Samuel's words had become a quiet mantra, a reminder of the responsibility that came with her role. She thought of him often, of the grace with which he had addressed her, the way he had used the moment to plant a seed rather than create conflict. It was a lesson she found herself returning to again and again. A lesson that went beyond her job, beyond any single interaction. It was about learning to see, to recognize the quiet dignity in others, to understand that respect was not simply a professional courtesy but a profound acknowledgement of shared humanity. As Lisa continued her work, she felt herself becoming more present, more aware of her own habits and assumptions. She realized that the work of unlearning prejudice was not a simple task, not a single act of awareness, but an ongoing journey, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to see herself with clarity. It was uncomfortable, even painful at times, but it was also freeing, a chance to reshape her understanding of herself, to grow beyond the narrow bounds of her own experiences. And in those quiet moments, alone in her small apartment, Lisa found a sense of peace. She knew she could not undo the past, could not change the way she had once viewed the world, but she could move forward with a new perspective, a renewed commitment to see the humanity in each person she encountered. And as she sat there, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point, she felt a quiet gratitude for the chance to begin again, to rewrite the story of her own understanding, one interaction at a time. The following week, Samuel found himself in a familiar conference room, its walls lined with framed photographs of aircraft and executives. He had sat in this very chair countless times before, discussing numbers, logistics, and new opportunities. Yet today, his purpose was different. This time, he wasn't simply here as a corporate negotiator but as an advocate, hoping to bridge an invisible gap that often went unspoken, a gap between everyday efficiency and human dignity. As he waited, he glanced over his notes, the words he had carefully prepared, knowing that he would need to approach the subject thoughtfully, without accusation. It wasn't about fault, but about understanding, a quiet, steady call for awareness. He had thought long and hard about this meeting, about how to make his words resonate without stirring defensiveness. It was a subtle balancing act, one that required him to hold firm to his principles while presenting them with calm and respect. The airline executives entered, offering friendly handshakes, their faces carrying the usual politeness but with a hint of curiosity. Samuel's reputation preceded him. They knew him as a calm, efficient leader, a partner who was focused on results. But today, his demeanor held a depth of seriousness they weren't accustomed to seeing. The discussion began with the usual formalities, covering updates on their shared goals and the progress of their collaboration. Samuel listened patiently, waiting for the right moment. Finally, when the time came for him to address his own agenda, he paused, allowing a brief silence to settle over the room. It was a silence that invited attention, an invitation for reflection. Before we conclude, he began, his voice even and thoughtful. There's a matter I'd like to bring to the table. It's a personal experience from my recent flight with your airline. One that left me with some concerns I believe are worth discussing. The room grew still, the executives watching him intently. Samuel continued, choosing his words carefully. I encountered a situation that reminded me of the subtle, yet pervasive impact of unconscious bias. It's something many of us don't often see or talk about openly. But it's there, shaping interactions in ways that can have real effects on people's experiences. He paused, letting the words settle, observing the faces around him. There was no defensiveness in their expressions, only attentive silence, a willingness to listen. Taking a quiet breath, Samuel recounted the incident, not in detail, but with enough clarity to convey the underlying issue. He described how a flight attendant's perception of him had led to a moment of discomfort and unease. An experience that, though brief, had lingered. It may seem like a small matter, he added gently, but for those of us who experience these moments regularly, it's a reminder of something larger, a reminder that, at times, we are seen for what we look like rather than who we are. One of the executives, a woman named Laura who had worked with Samuel on previous contracts, leaned forward, her brow furrowed with thoughtfulness. Thank you for sharing that, Samuel. We appreciate your honesty. It's something we don't often hear, but it's certainly important. Samuel nodded, encouraged by her response. I think there's an opportunity here for us to go beyond just business as usual. He continued, his voice calm but firm. Perhaps we could consider implementing more comprehensive training for employees. Something that addresses not only procedural tasks but also the value of empathy and awareness. Of recognizing each passenger as an individual rather than a set of assumptions. The others exchanged glances, and Samuel could see the idea taking root. Laura nodded, thoughtful. It's a challenging topic, but I think we can all agree it's a necessary one. We've focused so much on efficiency and customer service. But perhaps we've overlooked the importance of building a culture that truly respects diversity. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had held before. It was no longer about policies or profits, but about creating an environment where respect was more than a professional courtesy. It was a core value. Samuel could feel the quiet momentum building, a shared understanding forming between them, one that transcended the usual parameters of business. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to explore new initiatives, including enhanced training programs focused on empathy, cultural awareness, and bias. It wasn't a grand solution, nor a sweeping reform, but it was a step in the right direction, a small but meaningful beginning. As Samuel left the conference room, he felt a sense of quiet fulfillment, a confirmation that his efforts had not been in vain. He knew that real change took time, that progress often came in small, steady steps, but he also knew that conversations like these, grounded in honesty and respect, had the power to shift perspectives and open doors. It was a subtle kind of advocacy, one that worked not through force but through understanding, a way of speaking to the heart of the matter without raising voices or causing division. That evening, as he drove home, Samuel felt a calm resolve settle within him. The day's meeting had been a reminder of the strength in subtlety, of the quiet power that came from addressing difficult issues with dignity and patience. He thought of his children, of Malik and Amara, and the world they would inherit. In his own way, he hoped he was helping to shape that world, to make it a place where they could walk with pride, seen for who they truly were. And as he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of home waiting for him, he was reminded that change often began in the smallest of moments, in a single conversation. A quiet but firm decision to speak up. He stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of his family, carrying with him the steady, unshakable knowledge that, though the path was long, he was willing to walk it, one step at a time, with the calm assurance that some changes, though quiet, were as powerful as they were essential. In the weeks that followed her conversation with Samuel, Lisa found herself moving through her days with a heightened sense of awareness. Every action, every small interaction with a passenger, seemed to carry a weight she hadn't noticed before. She saw things differently now, like a filter had been lifted, revealing layers of complexity in her work that she had long ignored. It was not an easy shift, and often she felt an uncomfortable prickle of self-consciousness, a quiet realization that she had been operating on autopilot, missing the subtleties that lay within each exchange. Lisa found herself reflecting on her routines, on the countless small moments in which she had made assumptions without realizing it. She began to observe her own habits closely, noticing how often she had let stereotypes color her reactions. It was as if she had been following an unwritten script, one that had subtly shaped her responses and judgments, one that she hadn't questioned until now. Determined to change, Lisa had started small, making efforts to connect with each passenger in a way that felt more genuine. Instead of brushing through check-ins and boarding like a series of tasks to complete, she began to pause, to truly look at each person. She found herself smiling more, engaging more openly, and feeling more connected to her work. And in doing so, she realized how often her previous approach had been devoid of empathy. How she had shielded herself behind a wall of efficiency, missing out on the humanity in her role. One quiet afternoon, during a lull in the terminal, Lisa struck up a conversation with Maria, the senior flight attendant she had always admired. They sat together, sipping their coffee, the hum of the terminal around them a comforting background to their quiet exchange. "Maria," Lisa began, her voice soft, almost hesitant, "how do you manage to connect with people so easily? I've always admired how present you seem with every passenger." Maria smiled warmly, her gaze understanding. "It's not about what I do, really," she replied gently. "It's about how I see people. I try to remind myself that everyone's carrying something, stress, joy, worry, and if I can see them as people, not just passengers, it changes the way I respond." Lisa nodded, letting Maria's words sink in. It was a simple perspective, yet it was one she had somehow overlooked in her drive to be efficient. To keep things moving smoothly, she had allowed herself to get caught in the routine, to see passengers as a checklist rather than individuals with their own lives, their own stories. The changes Lisa made were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. She began taking extra moments during check-ins, offering a kind word, a genuine smile. She asked passengers if they needed help, not out of duty, but out of a newfound empathy. And as she did, she began to notice small shifts in the way people responded to her, a softening of tension, a brief but sincere smile in return. Yet it wasn't only the passengers who changed. Lisa herself felt lighter, as if she were shedding a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. With each small act of kindness, each gesture of acknowledgement, she felt herself becoming more grounded, more connected to the purpose of her work. She was no longer just performing a job, she was contributing to something larger. A quiet thread of humanity that stretched across each flight, connecting people in ways that transcended the ordinary routine of boarding passes and safety briefings. One day, during a particularly busy flight, Lisa encountered a young mother traveling alone with two small children. The woman looked exhausted, her face drawn and weary, her hands full as she tried to manage her children and her belongings. In the past, Lisa might have viewed the situation as an inconvenience, another challenge to manage, but this time, she felt only compassion, a desire to help. She approached the woman with a gentle smile, offering to carry her bags and assist with the children. The relief in the woman's eyes was immediate, a quiet gratitude that needed no words. As Lisa helped her settle in, she felt a sense of fulfillment, a small but profound reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness could make all the difference. In these moments, Lisa thought of Samuel, of the conversation that had sparked this shift in her. She hadn't fully understood the depth of his words then. Hadn't realized how deeply they would resonate. But now, with each small gesture, each act of quiet understanding, she felt as though she were honoring the lesson he had shared. It was a lesson that had gone beyond the specifics of their encounter, reaching into her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Samuel's calm, dignified presence had lingered with her, not as a reprimand but as a reminder of the quiet strength that came from truly seeing others. And now, she carried that reminder with her each day, letting it guide her interactions, her choices, her view of herself and her role. As the weeks turned into months, Lisa's transformation continued. She began reading more about empathy, about the impact of unconscious bias, about the subtle ways that prejudice could shape even the most routine aspects of daily life. She joined discussions at work, participating in conversations she would have once avoided. She found herself speaking up in team meetings, encouraging others to consider the impact of their words and actions, to think beyond the surface. Her colleagues noticed the change in her, the warmth that now colored her interactions, the newfound openness in her demeanor. And though Lisa never shared the details of her experience with Samuel, she knew that what he had taught her would remain a part of her, a quiet, guiding presence, a reminder of the power of empathy. In the end, her journey was not about seeking redemption or approval but about growing into a version of herself that she could respect. It was a journey toward awareness, a process of unlearning assumptions she had never questioned, of embracing the quiet, often difficult work of self-reflection. And as Lisa continued on this path, she knew that she was building something lasting, something deeper than a mere shift in perspective. She was building a new way of being, a commitment to seeing others fully, to recognizing the shared humanity that connected them all. It was a small change, perhaps, in the grander scheme of things, but it was a change that mattered, a change that, one interaction at a time, was slowly reshaping the world around her. Months passed, and the small changes that had begun with one quiet conversation rippled outward, touching lives in ways that were both subtle and enduring. Samuel continued his work, his days filled with meetings, negotiations, and the usual rhythms of his position. Yet within him, the memory of that flight, and his choice to confront it with quiet resolve, remained. It wasn't anger or resentment that stayed with him, but a sense of purpose, a reminder that his actions, however small, could contribute to a greater shift in understanding. Samuel had received an update from the airline shortly after his conversation with the executives. They had implemented new training modules, workshops on empathy and awareness, designed to encourage employees to consider their biases, to see beyond the surface of first impressions. It was a modest start, perhaps, but for Samuel, it symbolized something meaningful. Change, he knew, was rarely swift or immediate. It was built incrementally, one step at a time, through moments of honesty and a commitment to seeing others more fully. Meanwhile, in her own quiet way, Lisa continued her journey of self-reflection and growth. Each day she approached her work with a sense of purpose that had transformed her role into something more than a series of tasks. She had come to see her position not just as a job, but as a platform, a way to make others feel seen and respected. A small but meaningful contribution to the environment around her. She knew that the lessons Samuel had unknowingly imparted would stay with her for the rest of her life. One evening, while organizing her paperwork after a long flight, Lisa found herself reflecting on how far she had come. Her journey of change had been quiet, gradual, and filled with moments of self-doubt. There were still times when she slipped into old habits, times when her assumptions colored her perceptions. But now, she recognized those moments with clarity, aware of the importance of continuing to unlearn, to remain open and curious about the people she encountered. It was a chilly autumn night when Lisa and Samuel's paths crossed again. She was on duty for a flight that had been delayed, and as she helped passengers board, she saw a familiar face, Samuel, standing quietly, waiting to board. He caught her gaze and offered a small nod, a look of recognition that held no resentment, only calm acknowledgement. She smiled back, feeling a sense of warmth, a feeling of shared understanding that transcended words. As he walked past her to his seat, Lisa felt the weight of the moment. The knowledge that this single encounter had grown into something far larger than either of them could have anticipated. They were both changed, in ways that went beyond words. She felt a sense of gratitude, not only for his patience and grace that day but for the way his words had gently urged her to confront herself. To question what she had taken for granted. Samuel settled into his seat. The hum of the cabin around him. He glanced out the window. The city lights below casting a quiet glow against the night sky. He felt no need to dwell on the past or to analyze the moment. Instead, he allowed himself to feel the simple satisfaction of having acted with integrity, of knowing that his choices had, in some small way, helped create space for reflection, for awareness, for empathy. As the plane ascended, carrying them both into the vastness of the night, Samuel closed his eyes, letting his thoughts settle. He knew that there was no end to the work of unlearning bias. No end to the quiet labor of self-reflection. It was a process, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to see each moment as an opportunity to grow. Lisa continued her work that evening with a renewed sense of calm. She knew that the changes within her would not always be visible to others. That her journey of understanding was her own, shaped by small, everyday decisions. She didn't need validation or recognition for her growth. The real reward was in the quiet knowledge that she was becoming the person she wanted to be. A person who saw others fully. Who listened with an open heart. Who approached her work with genuine respect. For Samuel and Lisa, that flight had been more than just an uncomfortable moment. More than a misunderstanding. It had become a shared catalyst. A quiet but lasting shift in perspective that underscored the importance of empathy in a world so often divided by assumptions. And as the plane flew steadily through the night, they both carried with them a quiet resolve. A sense of purpose that would continue to shape their lives in ways unseen but deeply felt. In the months and years that followed, their paths would likely remain separate. Yet in the quiet moments of reflection, both would remember this experience, not as a moment of conflict, but as a gentle turning point. A reminder that even the smallest actions could foster change. And that understanding, like any journey, was built step by step. With humility, patience, and hope.